Hello there, a very good evening, and welcome to another episode of Face to Face. Our topic of discussion today is the need to expedite reforms, and we've got a person who's been advocating for reforms in Sri Lanka in various sectors for many, many decades, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives. A very good evening, Doctor,
Good
and
evening.
welcome to the show. Dr. Paikiasothy, let's start off with one of the most controversial pieces of legislation that has been in existence in Sri Lanka for an extended period of time. I think it will not come as a surprise to our viewers that this piece of legislation is the Prevention of Terrorism Act that has been in Sri Lanka for many, many decades. There have been many a government that has come into power pledging to repeal this piece of legislation because of the draconian provisions in that piece of legislation that has been abused over and over and over again, and has caused serious concern to innocent people among the general public, which is the most horrifying part of this piece of legislation. Now, Dr. Paikiasothy, even the current government, before they came into power, they were vociferous against this piece of legislation. They protested against this piece of legislation. They protested when people were arrested under this piece of legislation. It's been a year, or almost close to a year, since this government came into power. It's definitely been over a year since the president took office. Where do you see this government going as far as the PTA is concerned? Because to date, it has not been repealed. There were reports that the act to repeal this will come somewhere in September. Didn't really materialize. What's happening right now?
Well, I suppose the cynical version, and let's hope that's not the right version, is that the government never really intends. The government really does not intend to get rid of the PTA because it finds that the PTA is a handy piece of legislation to deal with dissent, and dissent will come up into the future. Yeah. So they said made all of these sort of comforting noises when the issue was up in Geneva. Now that the resolution has been passed, there is no urgency, I don't think, as far as they see it, to pass a bill. We had the Anti-Terrorism Act, which of course we all went to court on, and it got shelved. We haven't seen what this new version is going to be. And quite frankly, I don't know who they are consulting with in terms of coming up with this new legislation.
They're not consulting you?
No, they're certainly
anyone
not consulting me. Yeah.
Anyone from the any of these
As far as I know-
organizations that are involved in, of
As
course,
far as I know,
assisting.
they are not consulting any of the organizations dealing with fundamental rights. So I don't think they are in any hurry to do anything about it. And look, Mangala Samaravira promised when he was foreign minister, he went and said that there will be a moratorium, and subsequent governments also said that there would be a moratorium on the use of the PTA. But that's not been the case. There are people who are still being taken in under the PTA. So I'm not quite sure as to what the precise position is as far as this government is concerned.
Well, I think the president, recently speaking at an event, made a statement saying that any piece of legislation that is being passed in Parliament will be with the consent of the general public. I think he was speaking on the on the provisions to impose a ban on corporal punishment and bring in penal provisions in that regard. But taking that statement as a blanket enunciation of what the government intends on putting in Parliament, we saw that there was a massive opposition to the use of the PTA, especially when Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah was arrested under it, and several other poets, members of minority communities were arrested under the PTA. There was a massive uproar from society. But in recent times, we've seen the PTA being used again, and there are very, very innocent people who have been arrested under that. However, there has not been much of a public uproar against that. When you look at it kind of practically, maybe because of the fact that many of these organized criminals or island registered criminals, whatever you would like to call them, these people who well, who are being arrested from overseas, brought down with great effort. All of them are being detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and there seems to be almost a subtle approval from the general public on the use of the PTA for this sort of a thing. How do you view this change in attitude?
I think you're correct insofar as, given the number of cases of drug abuse and all of that, I think there is a general consensus on the part of the public that yes, you need draconian laws to deal with it. People again talking about capital punishment as far as drug offences are concerned. And in that respect, I think the government has succeeded in sort of holding the public's attention with regard to the crackdown on drugs and the crackdown on corruption in general. Yeah, how long it can sustain this is a question, because after all, I mean, the thing is, you can arrest people, you can get them to come and make statements, and then they can get off on bail until they're actually charged.
But these suspects are not being given bail; they've been detained.
So that's the ones on corruption. These ones are not being given bail.
No, the organized criminals are not being given bail either.
They're not being given bail, but we have yet to actually convict them and put them behind bars. And also, I think even with regard to corruption in general, and here it might also overlap into the drug thing, the public has a sense of who they think are responsible for this. And they would like to see those people also being caught. So I think the government can go along with this for some time, but it has to be careful that it doesn't become a sideshow in itself. And that there is a lot of other stuff that has to be done in terms of development and growth and all of that has to be attended to.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you saying that the government is more focused on, crackdown on drugs, crackdown on corruption, than genuine reform, genuine development? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I think, if you look at the government in the last 1 year, a lot of the emphasis has been on corruption and about holding people to account. But in terms of laying the groundwork for development, for the future growth of the country, I think they haven't been as, they haven't paid as sufficient attention as the public would expect, and indeed the country would expect, because, by 2027, we would be cleared of the IMF framework. And then what's going to happen? What is the strategy for growth? At one level, we hear the news that, yes, overseas remittances have gone up, tourism is high, all of that, and that there are things are supposed to be improving. But we can't just base our economic development on tourism and remittances. We have to come up with a proper strategy, and, well, the government is talking about IT and digitalization. So we need to know as to how far down the road they have gone and where they're taking us with regard to all of that.
So
there is a lack of communication.
Is it a case of the government not really, giving proper priority to development and rather prioritizing anti-corruption, the war against drugs? Or is it that, social media, mass media organizations in general just latch on to the more attractive side of things, which is the war against drugs and anti-corruption, and don't really focus on strategic development and what the government is really doing in that aspect?
Well, there might be an element of that,
Okay.
but I think it is incumbent on the government to make sure that it gets its message out, and with such force and emphasis as needs be. But I think, everything has been put into committee. There is a sort of sense that, people are talking about what to do, and once they have decided, they'll come out and tell us and whatever. They need to get their act together with that. It's the point about, the perception is not enough action.
So moving on, getting back to the repeal of the PTA, in your years of experience, of course, with different governments promising to repeal these draconian pieces of legislation, and coming into power, not really doing anything. Do you think that this time something will be different,
Well,
even belatedly?
Well, one still hopes. One still hopes, but the trajectory of events with regard to it are not particularly promising. It's not particularly promising. Why does one need to have committee after committee to look at what will replace the PTA? This has been going on for years. It's been going on for years.
So your organization, the Center for Policy Alternative, has been contributing to possible pieces of legislation that could replace the PTA. Where is the bottleneck really at? What are the provisions, or the draconian provisions, that the government thinks are necessary and you think are unnecessary? Where is the, where does it really stagnate?
The detention orders, the holding of people without trial, all of those things are what needs to go. They are draconian pieces of legislation. We know, for example, that people have been held under the PTA and haven't been charged.
For years.
For years.
For decades.
Well, indeed, for decades. I would say that's criminal. You take away the best years of someone's life. So one needs to look at this a lot more sensitively, a lot more from a rights perspective. And indeed, we need to also ask ourselves, do we really need special legislation? Or do we have legislation at the moment that can deal with this?
But thinking of, this government before they came into power, very much against the PTA, very much for the repeal of the PTA, and also the Online Safety Act, which was a new act that was brought, and from the get-go, the current government was against it. What's the bottleneck there, really, on the Online Safety Act? Let's at least say the PTA, let's just brand it as a necessary evil for the moment. Let's move to the Online Safety Act. What's the bottleneck there?
We're moving into a world which is going to be dominated by social media.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's a requirement for something like the Online Safety Act?
No, but the argument with regard to the Online Safety Act was that it was to look after women and children.
That was the argument that was propounded,
yes,
and was opposed as to not being the real intention behind the act.
There are 2 articles or something like that with regard to women and children, and we have laws that can deal with women and children. So it's a very flimsy argument at the end of the day. But it, as a piece of legislation that can be implemented and will be implemented, etc., it's very effective in squashing dissent. It's very effective in squashing dissent. And the categories that have been used in terms of supposedly to defend people or protect people against abuse, etc., they're far too broad. We need to be very careful when we bring in legislation that is supposed to protect people, etc., that we are very precise as to what these categories are.
This act could end up like the ICCPR Act.
Exactly. ICCPR Act was, after all, to protect people. And
civil and political rights, but it's
civil and political rights, and it ended up targeting the minorities.
So, moving forward, really, on the OSA, or repeal of the OSA, government again has been very silent on that. Again, brushing aside the PTA for the moment as a necessary evil, the OSA at the very least needs to be taken out, because the 3 big members of the current government voted against the act when the act was brought in. So what's the bottleneck there?
I don't think they really, once in government, and in terms of their forecasts as to the future political trajectory, I think they find pieces of legislation like this convenient and handy. And I hope I'm wrong in saying that. But what is it that is taking so long to come up with the alternatives? And who are they talking to? They can't just sort of say that, they maintain political stability as per the IMF framework. They must be able to, chew gum and play ball at the same time.
So the general public has always had a certain perspective on these pieces of legislation, particularly because the general public are left vulnerable and are victimized by these pieces of legislation. And they've voted for consecutive governments, maybe not being the chief reason for them voting for a government to repeal these pieces of legislation, but part of the reason why they voted for a different government. If this government also does not repeal these pieces of legislation, where do we go to then? Do we trust people who were in government before them, promised to repeal these acts, did not, and even ended up beefing up those acts in a way that they could victimize the general public even more? Where do we go from there?
Well, I mean, the way that our politics has played out, of course, is that, yes, the opposition will come up and say, we will get rid of it, and we will come up with a much more sensitive and empathetic alternative. Yeah, so we may get that. We may get it. But I think what we need to do, though, is the JVP government, when it was, campaigning to come into power, promised a whole lot of things. We need to hold them to those promises. I think
quite specific promises in their
yeah, quite manifesto. Specific, and indeed, PTA, OSA, then the whole question of reforming the Attorney General's office, bringing a public prosecutor. Yeah, we need to hold them to that, because if we don't do that, then we are really sort of letting the momentum for democratic reform slide.
So when we speak of the opposition in the country, of course, another very important element of the state that keeps the government in check. Now, we see the opposition also coming up and making statements regarding the NPP government not delivering on certain specific pieces of promises in their manifesto. Do you think the general public should inquire into whether the opposition is being really genuine about it, or they're just doing it for the clout of gaining power, or support them and try to push this government to get them passed?
If they can support them and hold this government to account, that would be good. But in order to support them, I think they must get a sense that the opposition is serious about wanting to get into power. And I think that's an issue at the present moment, in that they say they're talking. What is coming out of those talks, we don't really know.
Forming an alliance.
All of these things, what is happening there, we don't know what is going on. And so, if the political parties that form opposition are not serious about it, people will have to turn to civil society organizations to keep pushing.
So at this moment of time, you're of the view that the general public does not think that the opposition is serious about coming into power.
Everyone that I have spoken to says that. I haven't yet been able to speak to someone who tells me that the opposition as it exists today is a going concern.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know whether it is a problem with regard to personalities. And yes, I think Mr. Premadasa and Mr. Wickramasinghe needed to work together and make sure that, one is going to be the candidate and the leader, and the other, presumably, the mentor or whatever. Yeah, so that is a major problem. That is a major problem. And you see, there is also a need for the opposition party to come out with a clear alternative to the philosophy of the party in power. And that's something that they don't seem to be interested in doing at the present moment. They need to enunciate a clear alternative.
I think the opposition recently held a press briefing and announced a joint rally against the government in Nugegoda, I believe on the 21st of November. Their main theme being against constitutional autocracy. Do you think that is a running concern for the general public?
I don't think so at all. what is the constitutional autocracy that they're talking about? I mean, yes, the JVP has 158 seats in parliament.
59, I think.
Well, 59 with the speaker.
Yes.
Yeah. They can do anything, but they haven't done anything. They haven't presumably...
When you say haven't done anything drastic?
No,
massive.
drastic or massive. They haven't initiated major development projects or anything like that as such.
Oh, you're saying drastic in that aspect, and,
No,
and
yes.
not in a manner that really
No.
you know.
And indeed also in terms of when you say constitutional autocracy, what have they done that is autocratic as such in terms of legislation? Now, on the ground, there are various things that are happening which are not very conducive to a democratic culture, So putting up a fight, defending against that requires the opposition to go out and put up a fight, and we seem to be doing so. And also for them to come up with what is it that animates them, what is their political philosophy as such. That seems to be missing.
Based on what I've heard, political parties and representatives of political parties saying they're trying to rely on this whole left-wing camp, right-wing camp narrative. Do you think that will work out?
I think that's becoming fast outmoded. I think one has to look at politics, and not just in Sri Lanka. I think everywhere in the world, this is an issue. That sort of left-wing, right-wing duality, I don't think exists anymore. And so one has to really knock one's heads together and come up with proper philosophies that look at the rights and the norms that animate one, and also the practical political programs that reflect those norms in action.
Based on what you've said so far, it seems like the course for the government is quite clear. Abide by the promises you gave the people, initiate proper development in Sri Lanka, make sure that Sri Lanka does not face an economic crisis again, and are able to pay back our debts once the time when the due comes in 2028, I believe. So it's quite clear for the government, and of course to get their communication with the general public right. But speaking about the opposition, and the opposition really fulfilling the role of the opposition of keeping this government in check, what do you think is the best course of action?
Well, as I say, the opposition needs to come up with a clear philosophy of why it is in politics and what is the Sri Lanka that they want to see become. Then they have to choose the areas, particularly with regard to the economy. Look, I've said this a number of times. We have 1.4 billion people in the public service. That's unsustainable. Do they have a plan in terms of how they're going to reduce that amount? You can't just throw people out of a job. You have to have a way in which you move them out and provide them alternative employment. Yeah? So that's a major area. And of course, those 1.4 million, perhaps they're all JVP supporters at the last elections, but they need to be spoken to because that is something that has to be done. Then there are the smaller...
But the 1.4 million weren't really JVP supporters. They were in the public service before the JVP government came into power.
Yes, but I think most of them are JVP supporters.
Okay.
Because after the Rajapaksas took over, they packed the public service.
Yes.
With not the main sort of the senior officials, but there are lots of office assistants and all of them who are there, who are basically their supporters. Then you have to look at state-owned enterprises. Sri Lankan Airlines. We've been grappling with Sri Lankan Airlines for God knows ever since when. We have to deal with that. Furthermore, towards the middle 2030s or whatever it is, we're an aging population. We have to change our health service in that respect. We have to come up with sufficient number of doctors. The doctors who are going out of the country need to be brought back in. We need to make sure that there isn't political unrest and turmoil as a consequence of a lack of policy to position ourselves for the future. This digitalization and all of that is very good, and we need to go that way. But it's also going to have consequences for employment. You know, so
You need to upskill the employees also.
so there are a number of challenges in that respect that need to be looked at, and I'm not quite sure. I don't get a sense that the government is actually looking at this. You know, because I mean, you know, they say that, was it Mr. Tilvin Silva who said that when he went to China, the Chinese told him that if you really want to change things, it's got to take 10 years or whatever. You know, so, okay, if they're going to be here for 10 years, that means they're assuming that they're going to win the next election. But what are they going to be doing in those 5 years? Now, I mean, 27, as you said, I mean, the IMF deal, we would have concluded it. 28 is going to be the year before the major national elections. So whatever financial, fiscal discipline that we have managed to garner as a consequence of following the IMF prescriptions might be undermined. You know, we have, you see, the thing is this, is that at one level, we have yet to see what are the real policies of the JVP government apart from anti-corruption.
But when we speak about national policies, do you think that members of the general public would be able to see them clearly within the span of 1 year? Because we know developed countries, Western countries, minus the US at the current moment, given the turmoil they have in their political sector. If we look at Western countries, including Britain, France, countries like that, they have stable national policies. It doesn't really matter which government comes into power. They don't play around with national policies. So their policies have been developed not over the course of a few years, but over the course of several decades. So speaking in that perspective, do you think that it's practical to expect the general public or members of the civil society or media to really see the crystallization of the NPP policies 1 year after they took office for the first time in the history of the country?
Well, I mean, you know, when you say that that is not the case, I mean, you take the United States.
Okay.
The Trump administration.
You think they have stable policies?
Well, they are upsetting everything,
Yes.
including the international trading system that we have in the world. So, you know, the thing here is this, is that we don't seem to have a situation where we have sort of shadow cabinets and shadow ministers who can, once they get into government, start their policy of change. You know, and that I think is the problem. Because look, 158 members, they're not going to win that again. So they have a huge political legacy there. Now, what are they using it for in the next 4 years? I mean, I hope we will see what they're going to do, because I would have thought that the sooner you do it once you get into power, the easier it is for you and the better it is for the country as well. The further down the line that you go, then the whole question of the responsibilities of incumbency and all of that starts attaching to you, and it becomes somewhat difficult.
So it's a very thin line, because now all of these policies, decisions that are to be taken by the government, of course, they're very contentious. Some decisions, after being made, even at the recommendation of the general public and civil society, may flip the other way. And when that does happen, or if that ever happens, it's always the government that will have to bear the blame, the government that will have to bear the responsibility. So something that we're hearing from the government side also, when we speak to representatives of the government, is that they're being quite careful, quite cautious when they embark on these decisions, when they finalize on these policies. They want proper stakeholder consultations. They want a proper analysis of the situation, and that takes time.
Okay, they have a huge majority, which they're not going to get again.
Okay.
Stakeholder consultations, where are the consultations? Who are they talking to?
With regarding to the economy,
With
many
regard to the
parties.
economy, who are they actually talking to?
There have been discussions, with international players, with the IMF. You're speaking about local civil society representatives.
Locally, because the IMF deal goes in 27. IMF deal goes in 27. The future of this country is going to have to be decided in terms of a proper growth policy, economic growth policy. Who are they talking to?
So the fact
with
that
regard to that? I mean,
financial
maybe they are
indicators-
talking to people, but
Okay.
we don't know about it.
Okay. So you're saying the government should communicate better.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And in comparison to the way that they communicated when they were trying to get into office, campaigning to get into office, and how they are behaving in office, it's chalk and cheese.
Maybe spending a little bit more time on real government work. Back in the day, they didn't really have to do that.
Well, perhaps.
So moving forward again, when we speak of the opposition and what part they are to embark on, you expressed your views on that. But my question was particularly on what they should do practically, in the sense now they're attempting to form a massive alliance. We see that there are some issues as far as forming this alliance is concerned. Is that a viable path for the opposition to go down on?
The opposition has to go down to the grassroots and ensure that it has a proper, effective organization at the grassroots. Because that is where the JVP scores. They have to do that if they're going to build an opposition that is going to take the JVP on at the next elections.
But
they have to.
Forming an alliance, is that the best way to do it? Do you think?
Well, I mean, okay, because when the SJB formed, they took a large part of the UNP organization with them. So basically, that alliance is going to be an alliance of UNP organizers, or what were traditionally UNP.
But the SLPP is saying that the UNP, the SJB, the Hello Rumea, the Pivithru Hello Rumea, all of them are now part of this alliance, although no SJB representatives were really present at that.
No, but I mean, who heads the alliance?
Who heads the alliance?
No,
Good question.
exactly. Because at the end of the day, we don't want it all to be leader-centric, but you need to know who the leaders are. Who will contest the presidency in 2029 or whenever the presidential election is going to be. Who from this alliance?
So
what does this alliance stand for? There is the populism of the Rajapaksas, there is the capitalism of the UNP, there is something in between from the SJB. What is the color, the shape,
Do you think that these political parties can agree on one sort of consistent policy, one line of thinking, and at least select one leader? Do you think that is a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility if the government of the day is behaving badly. Therefore, they can all come together and say, no, we have to get these guys out. But when it is not behaving as badly as where
They behave.
as where they can sort of say, yes, we have to get rid of them, they have to come up with proper policies. Proper policies. I mean, 2048, which is when we're going to have 100 years. Now, 2048 is not that far away. What kind of Sri Lanka are they positing for the people of Sri Lanka? Those are things that they should come up with a vision. They should come up with a vision. The JVP, I suppose, came up with a vision when they were campaigning to get into office, and now maybe they've got bogged down with the nitty-gritty of government or whatever. But they need to come up with a vision that will excite the people, Because at the present moment, just think about it. If you are a young person wanting to get a job, you will want to get a job abroad. If you have a qualification, you also want to go abroad.
There might be people who would disagree with you given the current situation.
No, but I mean, come on.
overseas.
Look at the numbers who left this country from 2024 onwards.
2024 onwards.
No, sorry, even 22, 23.
I think those are quite
they-
drastically different times.
But still, the trajectory is not to remain here. They will have to remain here when they find out that they can't stay outside.
But everybody thinks that the grass is greener on the other side.
Everybody thinks that the grass is greener on the other side. You're quite right. But in some cases, it might well be true.
In some cases.
Yeah.
One final question, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. It's been amazing having this discussion with you. We're all looking at Sri Lanka being able to make good on its debt repayments in 2028 after the IMF program is done. Nobody in Sri Lanka wants to go back to the IMF for the 17th time, I believe. I've lost track now. In any case, do you think that the discussions that are going on in Parliament and the contribution of the opposition to the government bears the responsibility of making all the proper decisions, doing that, so on and so forth. Whether or not they do it properly, people will respond at the next election. But it's also incumbent on the opposition to contribute positively to this discourse to ensure that Sri Lanka does not default on their loans again. Do you think that that conversation is really happening in Parliament, outside Parliament, wherever the case may be?
I mean, there are certain opposition figures like Harsha De Silva and all of that who have, Kabir Hashim and Iran, who have come up with a lot of, policy statements and all of that, which make sense and which need to be taken seriously.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a question of who amongst them is going to sort of galvanize the rest of the population, because it's not just a question, I don't think into the future that we can just have a kind of elite level conversation in terms of what is required in the country. I think after the Aragalia and all of that, it has to be
broad-based. Thank you very much, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, for a very interesting conversation on Sri Lanka's future and the need, of course, to expedite reform and for the government to keep true to the promises that they made to the general public. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of Face to Face. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.